Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M. Spitz, the Ukraine War Frontline update for the 11th of November 2022, Veterans Day and Remembrance Day, and whatever that is called in the many countries around the world to which this is being beamed. Thank you very much for watching. We're going to go to the northeast sector of the front line, but as ever, when I do these videos, I forget to put up what tells you about the lines on my map. So as you can see, I'm stalling until I find it in my files. There it is. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please pause the video and check them out. Right, okay. There is not a lot of change, as you can see, to that northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea. If we go to the Institute for the Study of War, the American military think tank, they do say Ukrainian ground forces spokesperson Fitchio stated that Russian forces have slightly increased their focus on assault operations in the Kupiansk direction and are beginning to use more vehicles in ground assaults. This is interesting because if that's true, they seem to be upping the ante in a number of places. In Avdiivka, obviously in Bakhmut, in this northeastern axis, although they are taking their foot off the gas somewhat in the south and possibly along the Dnipro River, although we'll talk about that when we come to it. But this is a shift in momentum, I think, across the whole of the front line, where the Russians are possibly moving into an offensive posture in more than just isolated positions. Of course, do they have the force quantity and the quality with that force quantity? So while they're continually mobilizing troops, so I've often said they just don't have the reserves, and I don't think they do have strength and depth, which is why they have been moving forces, robbing Peter to pay Paul in some places, but then they are able to commit huge numbers of troops to Avdiivka, losing maybe as many as 10,000. They are continually restocking with humans in their meat assaults, or just up and down the front line through mobilizing, crypto mobilization, all sorts. So there are forces there, but we can't guarantee, whether they are well trained and well equipped, etc., etc. Anyway, as we can see, not too much change there to the northeastern sector. There are areas where there is activity, repelled attacks, so on and so forth, as you can see from the Institute for the Study of War, Petropavlivka, Serebyansky Forest, so on and so forth, but nothing to write home about. We're going to go to Bakhmut next, as per normal, and you can see that there, as according to Syriac Maps pro-Russian mapper, there is some gain for the Russians around the Avdiivka area. We are seeing the Russians really pushing back all along the front, both north and south of Bakhmut, where the Ukrainians were seeing most of their joy on the front line in this area. We are now seeing them struggle to maintain their lines under quite a bit of pressure from the Russians there. The ISW says a Russian mill blogger published and claimed to have geolocated footage on November 9th, indicating Ukrainian forces slightly advancing north of Klishchiivka. So this is interesting, although a couple of days ago, so potential gains for the Ukrainians. This is positional combat operations in southern flank of Bakhmut, shelling on the position the armed forces of Ukraine in a culvert under the railway embankment north of Klishchiivka. This might therefore be a little bit out of date. We can see that north of Klishchiivka, the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians back in certain areas here, at least according to Syriac Maps. Let's have a look at what this geolocation is. So yeah, that is pretty much, I wouldn't say that shows an advance for the Ukrainians. I think that even though the Russian lines are further back there, the Ukrainian lines will probably be at the railway line trying to have defensive positions there. So yeah, or it could indeed show an improvement in Ukrainian lines through into the grey zone. The ISW continues, Russian forces continue to attack Ukrainian positions in Bakhmut's northern and southern flanks, and yesterday made confirmed territorial gains. So geolocated footage published on the 10th shows that Russian forces marginally advanced in the forest area north of Klishchiivka, so it's going to be fairly similar to where we're talking about there. So 5th Ukrainian Assault Brigade shells Russian infantry and positions inside the forest between Bakhmut and Klishchiivka, geolocations in a thread. So these are Russians being hit by Ukrainians in a number of different positions. We'll just plug these in again and see what turns up. So this is Russians in positions north of where we were there. Now, this is an interesting area because if the Russians are genuinely going to attack Klishchiivka, Andrew Perpetua spent a lot of time talking about this on his live stream. Go and watch that last night. Excellent live stream as ever on a Friday evening. But he talks about, and I've mentioned this before, Klishchiivka is on lower ground. Let's go into 3D territory, shall we here? So it's on lower ground beneath the kind of the high ground, the hills that come up behind it towards the west. And on the top of one of the main kind of high ground areas here, we have this, and this is old footage now from Google. This would be even more extensive. You have all of these. Although that looks different from when I last looked, because Google is in the process of updating its satellite imagery for Google Earth at the moment. So that might be new. I think this is actually newer imagery showing, because I wonder if Klishchiivka itself, no, this is not destroyed. But I wonder, this definitely looks like different imagery from previously. And you can see more extensive trenches built. Anyway, this is the key to Klishchiivka, is what I was saying. So if you are the Russians, you aren't going to want to attack Klishchiivka along here because these have all been destroyed, these buildings. They don't offer any real protection for your troops and you're just easy pickings from above. Andrew Perpetua is saying, but this appears to be what the Russians are doing, though. They seem to be intent on just taking back the area because they lost it, rather than concentrating on taking back the strategically or tactically, more important heights here. Well, actually, this activity over in the forest area there, which is being geolocated, as according to the ISW, is perhaps showing a desire to do that. I don't know what is going on. My map is refusing to do what I want it to. Oh well, you get the point there, right? Let's find a couple more of those geolocations and see if they can help us. So again, we have, if I can sort my computer out, we have the Ukrainian assault brigade shelling moving Russian infantry, and this is geolocated to this position. Wait for it. And that is even further towards where Suryat Maps has the Russian defensive lines and further along this high ground here. So again, that might feed into this idea that the Russians could be trying to move along the, I wouldn't call it a ridge, but the top of that high ground there along towards the trenches that the Ukrainians are defending, and again back in that forest area there. So yeah, Russians are potentially moving forward in that area, as well as further to the south near Avdiivka, at least according to Suryat Maps there. Andrew Perpetua talks about how, he's just posted today, about how the trenches in the Bakhmut area look like this, and they probably do elsewhere along the front line. So expect it to be difficult conditions that will affect the fighting on both sides. Offensive and defensive operations will be affected by conditions. Anyway, to continue here in the ISW, a Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces regained some previously lost positions north of Avdiivka, near a water feature, and secured a position of a forest strip behind the railway track, pushing Ukrainian forces away from the T0513 highway. The mill blogger added that Ukrainian forces continue to hold positions north of Klishchiivka behind the railway line, and noted that mines, Ukrainian drones, and mutual artillery fire are complicating Russian attacks on Bakhmut's southern flank. That is to say that around this area by Avdiivka, the Russians are successfully pushing the Ukrainians away from this highway coming north to south that goes through Avdiivka on the southern edge of Bakhmut, not Avdiivka, sorry, or Pitny here on the southern edge there. So that was where the Ukrainians, I guess, really would have wanted to get to. It appears that the momentum has somewhat shifted. Indeed, in that area, you can see here, Suryat Maps has situation south of Bakhmut. Russian army launched a new counterattack and managed to expel Ukrainians from the positions east of the railway in front of the village of Avdiivka. Okay, just to continue with the ISW, SW. One Russian mill blogger similarly claimed that Russian forces continue to counterattack near Klishchiivka and Bakhmut, so that is to the north of Bakhmut, and have successfully pushed Ukrainian forces several hundred meters from the railroad near Klishchiivka. Russian mill bloggers also claim that Russians have continue to advance near Bakhmut Reservoir and are advancing further west along the railway north of Bakhmut. So just to give you an understanding of what's going on there, we have seen the Russians have success around the Bakhmut Reservoir, which isn't full of water anymore, and are progressing along the railway line as it comes down in this direction. So that is a challenge for the Ukrainians, as they are giving the Russians kind of, I've talked about potentially it's an operational withdrawal really as they're pulling back, but they are counterattacking there as well in this area there, I believe, putting up strong counterattacks to the Russians, but they are certainly on the back foot in the north and arguably to the south, as there have been some claims that they've redeployed, the Ukrainians that is, have redeployed troops from Bakhmut to other areas. And this goes back to what I was saying, I think, in my last video, that basically the Ukrainians just need another 100,000 troops. Easier said than done, right? But they, in order to prosecute decent offensives, this just takes a greater mass, I think, than they have. And they could have continued to push in Bakhmut, but that would require more troops, and they need those troops elsewhere in light of attacks from Russians in certain places. Like Avdiivka is looking increasingly dodgy for the Ukrainians. So difficult times for the Ukrainians, but the Russians themselves are suffering, I think, with a lack of quality troops in quantity. If we come to Avdiivka further to the south, so we've just been in Bakhmut, we're now coming to Avdiivka, where the situation is fairly similar to what we have seen recently. The Russians are pushing further along the railway line to the north and northwest of Krasnohorivka too, as well as pushing westwards towards Stepovo and in fact into Stepovo, as according to Suryat maps. And Andrew Perpetua is talking about that, saying that more of a grey area there, and I'll show you some footage from there, but still not looking good for the Ukrainians, as the Russians are being able to consolidate their positions that they have gained and keep pushing on, and all it takes is just getting into this industrial area, and I think it then presents itself as a real challenge for the Ukrainians to take back what they have lost. Andrew Perpetua has a very kind of grim prognosis here for the area, which is that it is going to be something that the Ukrainians are going to find very difficult to reverse. He sees that Avdiivka is essentially going to fall to the Russians, absent of any kind of huge counterattack that might, I don't know, cut down here or somewhere, maybe even up, as he says, through the belly here. But in order to do that, you've got to bring your resources through Avdiivka, and this is under fire control here, so you're unlikely to see an attack up there. It's more likely to come down from here, but he's saying really they should be creating defensive trench works and defensive fortifications in this kind of area, because the days of Avdiivka being under Ukrainian control are most probably numbered, which is not an entirely positive outlook, but it's potentially a realistic one, really, given that the Russians are willing to expend so much in terms of equipment and personnel to taking small amounts of land. Stupin, Ukrainian spokesperson, stated Russian forces' most important target is the Avdiivka coke plant, because capturing a plant would allow Russian forces to establish defensive positions in an industrial area instead of a forested terrain. I've said this basically that I think that only goes one way when they're in this area, and I don't think you'd be able to easily flush the Russians out. And I think once they're in there, that is, you're spreading Russian control moving southwards. They are obviously going to try and do that. It's very close to their established positions already. It won't take a lot, but the Ukrainians are obviously holding on. They are also getting absolutely hammered by aviation, the Ukrainians, and that's the challenge for them. Andrew Perpetua's analysis last night is the only thing really to allow the Ukrainians to succeed here would be bombing the crap out of the Russians, and they just seem to be unable to do that. Their JDAMs either, so these are the guided glide bombs that the Russians are using, their own versions, FAB 500s, and some bigger bombs as well than the 500 kilograms. They've also got the 250 version. What are the Ukrainians doing? Well, they're not really using them. What are the options? Either they're getting electronically jammed, which has been declaimed before, or they just don't have them yet in the quantities due to manufacturing issues, which is also being claimed. And a third option, which is also being claimed, is they don't have the airframes to release these bombs. Now, all three of those could well be, and I would probably say are the issues. They don't have the airframes, they don't have enough of the bombs, and they also have issues with jamming. So and add to that, even if they had enough of all of them, they don't have air advantage in the area. So being able to release those bombs in positions where their aircraft are susceptible to Russian air defenses or air-to-air missiles from Russian fighters firing, beyond the visual horizon type thing. It's just really difficult. So the kind of weapons they need to use, they are basically unable to use for those four reasons. And I don't think any of those single reasons changing will change the situation too much, because you still got the other three issues. So you start getting loads of JDAMs. Well, if you don't have the planes and you can't use the planes and they're getting jammed, then you've got to solve all of those four issues before you can start seeing these being used to significantly hammer. And it's the same for the southern front really as well. Hammer those trench lines with 1,000 or 500-pound bombs or whatever. Then in the absence of that, the Russians will just use their overwhelming mass to grind territorial gains there. So Suryat Maps said that the Russian army has managed to enter the first houses in Stepover and are trying to capture the rest of the village. So this goes towards this little advance they've made along the tree line here and into the first houses of Stepover, which will be, pretty much rubble by now, I would assume. Military Lab says, according to the latest report from Russian source Rebar, Russian forces crossed the railway in the direction of Stepover, but were forced to withdraw and switch to defence, trying to consolidate their positions east of the railway tracks. According to Rebar, Ukrainian forces continued to counterattack in the Novokalinove and Krasnohorivka axis, but without much success. So that is the claim, that they went in and then moved back out. That could well be true, actually, because there is this footage here. So Stepover north of Avdiivka. Again, I'm not going to show this to you. I really want to show this to you, though. It's an interesting bit of footage where you see some Russian troops running amongst the houses there, and then getting into I don't know, some opening. I don't know whether it's like some bomb shelter, a mine entrance, or I don't know, some kind of weird dugout entrance or something, that then gets hit with a FPV drone, as far as I can work out. And then this Bradley just basically drives up and down this road, absolutely raking the buildings here with its fire. So it looks like, at least as far as that footage, which could be heavily edited and you're not quite sure, but at least as far as that footage is concerned, it looks like the Ukrainians were giving the Russians a heck of a hard time there, which could suggest that they sort of did push in, but then had to move back out. Now, outside of Avdiivka, this footage is also pretty significant or interesting, because we hear in packages of aid that the US are giving, they always have a shed load of tow missiles. So tow missiles are these optical wired missiles that are fired from the top of Bradleys generally, and then you have to have line of sight to the target rather than a fire and forget, and you can turn around and drive away. You can't quite do that with these. They are pretty decent though, and they've got fairly decent enough range, but yeah, the packages are consistently giving loads of these, so they must be using loads of these, but I haven't seen a crazy amount of footage of tow missiles. Well, here apparently is one, and again, I can't really show it to you, but you've got a troop accumulation here getting out the back of this IFV, I think, and you've got another one just down here, another one up there, and this gets absolutely blitzed by a tow coming from the right that obviously, doesn't have a positive effect on those troops there. I don't know what happens after that, because you'd expect really the other two vehicles to be sitting ducks for subsequent rounds to hit them, but nonetheless, there is activity. The Russians are losing still a lot of equipment and troops in the area, to the point where if we go to the ISW here, and I've told you this already, but Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Zaluzhny has reported that Ukrainian forces have destroyed over 100 Russian tanks, 100 armored vehicles. Actually, the claim I heard was 100 tanks, 250 armored vehicles, and 50 artillery systems. So I'm pretty sure that they've misreported that. And 7 Su-25 aircraft during Russian assaults on Avdiivka over nearly a month. Zaluzhny added that Russian manpower losses in the area total about 10,000 personnel, and Stupin reported that the daily Russian casualties average between 400 and 600 personnel, and noted that Ukrainian forces use aerial reconnaissance and intelligence to prevent Russian forces from reinforcing their troops operating in the Avdiivka direction. Now, that's the Ukrainian commanders saying, hey, we are hammering the Russians and painting it in a positive light. I would say, and I agree with Andrew Perpetua here, is that as long as the Russians can keep piling troops into these areas, then the Russians can lose that amount of people and still gain in some kind of either Pyrrhic victory, where they leave themselves completely exhausted and ripe for a counterattack, or just a victory of overwhelming the opposition with sheer number. So those are the sources there. Another one here, Global War Monitor, saying Russia has advanced to the railway line and Ukrainian forces are actively trying to stop them from attacking Stepova and then moving on to Berdichi and other areas. So that is what's happening in Avdiivka in the north. We'll have to watch that really closely, because I think any movement, any successful movement into Stepova and into the coke plant, and you're really in trouble here. It's so difficult unless you're going to do a major counterattack. So difficult to see that going any other way. Now, Andrew Perpetua doesn't show on his map any changes here to the Russian defensive line, but he does show a gain for the Ukrainians into this kind of Pervomaisky to Pisky area here. I think Pisky kind of takes over in this road intersection there. The Ukrainians have hit. The Russians, I think, have hit Ukrainians with drone attacks in this area, which suggests that the Ukrainians are much further forward than was previously thought. So the idea is that around here, the Ukrainians might well be much further on, but unsure. He said, as you can see, his Russian defensive line is there, but he said there are claims that the Russians have been pushed back to this intersection, and in fact these last few houses are grey zone and the Ukrainians are right up to basically where the Russian defensive line is. But he hasn't changed his map, but he's saying that is some of the claims. The person that made those claims is fighting in that area, but he's also previously said that the Ukrainians have made some gains in the south of Pisky over here, which hadn't ended up being correct. So he's just like, not quite sure yet, just going to leave that. But there could be some success for the Ukrainians in that area. Then as we come further, no, I haven't given you this part that I'd highlighted. So Russian mill bloggers claim that Ukrainian forces counterattacked in the Avdiivka direction on the 10th and reportedly recaptured previously lost positions. A Kremlin-affiliated mill blogger claimed that they counterattacked northeast of Vodyane and regained some of those positions, and they are consistently trying to regain lost positions. So Vodyane is here, and we had seen a little bit of a pushback in this area. I think yesterday I noted some, as according to, I think, Deep State maps in that area, the yellow line there. But anyway, as we come out of Avdiivka, come down past... Oh, one thing I wanted to note, I'm always banging on about same named places. Well, Andrew Perpetua again pointed out one I hadn't seen before, which is Novo, and some people say, all countries have this. They don't have it to this degree. And I had a Ukrainian tell me himself that this is a problem in Ukraine, and they just get really frustrated because you can't say go to Bakhmutivka. It's like, which one? And they're so close to each other. So look at Bakhmutivka here, right? And then if we zoom in a little bit more to this general area, you have, where are you? I saw you. I know you're here. There is another Bakhmutivka in this area, which is, there it is, Bakhmutivka. So on my same screen, you've got Bakhmutivka separated by a road and then some fields and then another Bakhmutivka. What are you doing, Ukraine? What are you doing? You are just trying to confuse people. So I'm not having this, but many counties in the US, or many states in the US have the same names. Yeah, that's separated maybe by a couple of 100 miles. This is literally over the road, over the railway line, and you've got another Bakhmutivka. Anyway, we're going to go from this Krasnohorivka, from this Krasnohorivka down to this Krasnohorivka to actually onto Novomykhailivka. And Andrew Perpetua in his live stream was talking about a counterattack that was repelled around here that would caused the Russians to suffer quite a lot of losses again. So they're still trying to attack here. The Ukrainians holding on and repelling, and it's repelling the Russian attacks and causing quite a lot of loss for the Russians. Active around Vuhledar and Mikhailska, which is again seeing some losses for the Russians. They are pushing in so many places at the moment, but not having the success I'm sure they would hope for, given the amount of resources they are expending. And not a lot to report from Velika Novosilka, although the ISW does report there that I think the Ukrainians are pushing in a couple of places there. 3 Ukrainian attacks repelled in that kind of border area. So they are attacking. But as you can see a larger circle around the area further to the east here in Novodonetsk and Novomayorsk. So yeah. And then, as I've already said, to further to the east, even there. So we come down to Robotina. Not a lot of change, or no change into the map as I use in this area. The ISW says that the Russian MOD claimed that Russian forces repelled 14 Ukrainian attacks near Verbove and Robotina in the past week. That's actually not that much. In one whole week, 7 days, 14 attacks, 2 a day. Yeah, I mean, we've seen that happening in a single day just in certain places. So 14 attacks in a week isn't great. But my opinion is that the Ukrainians have upped their attacks in and around Novoprokopivka and Kopani and Verbove and north of Verbove over the past week, and I think as well down to the south here. So this is possibly somewhere to look for. They are having some success there. The question is how many resources, how many people and bits of kit do they have to throw into this to make the kind of gains they need, those meaningful gains. I mean, really, they want to be getting down to Tokmak, or they're struggling to get over this first line of defense, in any sizable manner. But it could be they're trying to do that because they're having success over here in the Krinky area and Pidstepny and even further to the south along this Dnipro river. So are they going to be pushing for some kind of larger pincer? But again, it goes back to this idea that they just need shed loads of troops to be able to do that. When we look at the sources, it's looking more positive for the Ukrainians around here. But we're going to talk about that in a second. So the Ukrainians opened a new axis of attack on the left bank during recent operations. The Ukrainian forces managed to retake positions on the northern Dachas on Potemkin Island, moving south. Also, the AFU took positions in the east of Bilhorodova, northwest of Holopristan. Okay, let's put that on my map. So this is something that Andrew Perpetua has shown, that this is Potemkin Island here, I believe, but it's actually on this bit just across the part of the river here, where this Dacha area all the way down here was under the control of the Russians. The Russians have been pushed back, and as you can see, Andrew Perpetua has this whole area now not under Russian control. So that is a significant move, and that's, I think, what Noel Reports is talking about, given that Holopristan is just here. So a push here as well as the pushes up around Oleshki. You've got Antonivsky Bridge, the road bridge, the railway bridge. You've got Poyma, Pishchenivka, Pidstepny, as well as potentially between Kozachi, Lahiri and Pidstepny, and then Krinky as well. Okay, let's go and look at other sources. So Suryat maps, just to remind you, this was yesterday's ones I reported, but that was that area that I've just shown you along the coast there that the Ukrainians have gained, and that is now both mappers are sort of agreeing with that, Andrew Perpetua and Suryat maps. And again, this is Global War Monitor also confirming that, although there's the argument that he refers on those other mappers. Anyway, today, Ukrainian artillery targeted a column of 11 Russian vehicles like the good old times. Now, I showed you this, or at least referenced it in my video this morning. Why this is important is because actually this affects the Russians' ability to defend attacks like the one you're seeing towards Holopristan, because this is in a place called Avdiivka, where they had an accumulation of trucks and troops, and they were absolutely hammered by HIMARS rocket attacks. Now that you can see in a number of different angles of video footage. Here, Military Lab says Ukrainian artillery ambushed a Russian column of 11 trucks 20 kilometers south of Oleshki. On the footage, it appears that only 3 out of 11 trucks survived the HIMARS strikes, with Russian forces also suffering heavy casualties as many KIA and wounded soldiers were seen getting evacuated. You can see, as I say, there's a number of different videos on this. A different video from the same region, Avdiivka, Kherson region. 1 Ural truck, 2 Kamaz trucks were destroyed, with a Ural 4 320 36 truck with damage in Avdiivka. So yeah, just lots of Russian logistics and troop accumulations being hammered. I'll put these videos in the links to these in my description, so you can check them out and see what took place. But the Russians have taken some serious losses in that general area. Russians in Kherson, says Kiev, complain that they are helpless to the continuing advance of the Ukrainian forces. Heavy fighting still going on in Krinky, says this Russian source. The enemy has already moved on to storm the forest belt near the village, which we wrote about earlier. The enemy forces managed to gain a foothold in that part of the forest that adjoins the southern outskirts of Krinky. That is, the enemy is systematically trying to advance in the to the Armyansk-Melitopol highway. The enemy has good artillery, drones, electronic warfare, but we have weak counter-battery warfare and a big problem with electronic warfare. Enemy drones fly over our positions as if they were at home, while our drones are shot down and landed on the territory controlled by the Ukrainians very quickly. This is exactly what I've been talking about the last few days, that all the threads are being drawn together in this area so that the Ukrainians can successfully attack across the river. The Russians have no counter-battery fire because they don't have the drones in the air, because the Ukrainian counter-drone activities, the electronic warfare, which means that the Ukrainians themselves can bring their artillery to bear and use counter-battery fire and artillery to hit Russian sources. They also got HIMARS in the area, as we've already seen. And that means that without the drones spotting for the Russians, they can get their troops and equipment across the river more easily. So all of this works together. Now, Russians have the advantage of being able to use aviation guided guide bombs that are really difficult for the Ukrainians to deal with, because they're big old bombs and they drop quite a lot of them around here. So that's their main issue. But it's looking positive for the Ukrainians here at the moment. So the question is, what do the Russians do? And again, Andrew Perpetua talked about this a lot on his feed last night. As the Ukrainians move south into this forest area, they're going to be very difficult to dislodge. But if the Russians do bring a lot of resources to the area, so the idea that they have more reserves than you might think they do, or they start bringing reserves, like I talked about, they're potentially bringing reserves down from Robotyne. So it's a 7th GAAD, the VDV, the paratrooper division, who had already been brought down to Robotyne from elsewhere, and are now being brought from Robotyne arguably to this area to defend. Now, if they can bring enough resources to bear here, you've got the following options. Either the Ukrainians pile in even more resources and try and establish a proper bridgehead here. But those resources, he argues at least, will probably have to come from somewhere else. I've been saying they do have quite a lot of resources in this area, as I think they were ready to do this anyway. But the argument might be that they need to bring them from elsewhere, which weakens elsewhere, rather like the Russian dilemma. So they either succeed in doing that, or they fail in doing that, so they pile in resources, but the Russians beat them back and they take big losses and have to go back to the other side of the river with their tail between their legs, or they decide it's not worth doing and pull out. We'll have to see what happens. I mean, it looks quite positive here, and I'd be quite boyish about trying to maintain a foothold here and push on. I think, you know, they could do it, but the problem is getting large amounts of equipment across the river. And if they can't do that to significant levels, then they might be hamstrung in moving across here, because they're going to have to move, you know, at walking pace, and leave themselves sort of vulnerable to being picked off. So they need a lot of equipment across the river, and it might come down to that. But if they are presenting problems in multiple places along this river, then that gives them a greater chance, because the Russians are keeping on guessing where they're going to go and have to spread themselves thinner and bring more reserves to bear there. But anyway, if you want to go and listen to that kind of discussion and analysis, Andrew Perpetua has that on his live stream there. And just as a general comment, this I thought was quite interesting from JMT Politico, who is in Ukraine, or at least I think he might be in Ukraine at the moment. When the F-16s get here, all these air defense systems will be moved towards the front lines to protect the F-16s. We have a massive amount of air defense just sitting and waiting. They're waiting to implement it all together at the same time. That's interesting. Nothing I've heard previously. Take that with a pinch of salt. But it could be that I've talked about getting air defense systems to the front line previously. It might be they're waiting to do that in tandem with those F-16s. But you'd think, well, you might as well have them positioned at least somewhere rather than sitting and waiting, because my goodness, they need air defense systems in position, don't they? That's something to think about. Anyway, hopefully that gives you an idea of what's going on the front line. Lots to watch out for. In certain areas looking positive for the Ukrainians, in other areas really looking like a challenge. Let me know what you think in the thread below. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.